You think the worst part of getting fired is losing your income? It is not. The worst part is watching a hollow suit steal 6 years of your sweat and blood, rebranding it as his innovation. But there is an unwritten rule in corporate tech: never piss off the person holding the source code. He demanded a system with zero barriers. I gave him exactly that, and it chewed his entire legacy alive. Welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without an operating budget to pay our hard-working team. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support allows us to pay our staff for their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. Now, let us dive right in. My name is Madison Hudson. I am 32 years old, a self-taught data architect who clawed my way out of a gritty, working-class neighborhood in Detroit to reach the glittering, air-conditioned glass towers of Austin, Texas. For the past 6 years, my entire existence revolved around Aegis Vertex Financial, a premier investment bank handling hundreds of millions in daily transfers. I did not just work for them, I built their digital immune system from the ground up. I named it the Sentinel Protocol. It was far more than just a standard security software program. It was a breathing, hyper-vigilant network of algorithms that I had relentlessly fine-tuned over thousands of sleepless nights. Sentinel could spot the most sophisticated money laundering schemes just by reading the micro-fluctuations in routing behavior. It caught shell companies, it flagged offshore tax dodgers, and it kept the federal regulators far away from our front doors. Then came Preston Sterling. Preston did not earn his corner office. He was parachuted into the chief executive officer position thanks to the immense, undeniable gravity of his family's generational wealth and board connections. He was the absolute, walking embodiment of the modern corporate hustle bro culture. He strutted around the trading floor wearing expensive tailored suit jackets with no ties, obsessively checked cryptocurrency charts during risk assessment meetings, and spoke almost entirely in hollow, recycled buzzwords. He loved to pace the room and preach about democratizing capital flows and fostering disruptive thinking. To Preston, banking was not a heavily regulated industry requiring meticulous risk management. It was simply a massive frat party with a larger operating budget. From his very first week, Preston decided I was the enemy. He hated me for one simple reason: I refused to play along with his delusional, technologically illiterate fantasies. While the rest of the executive team nodded eagerly at his presentations to protect their end-of-year bonuses, I was the one who constantly asked the hard, uncomfortable questions about compliance and federal security standards. He despised my pragmatism. During a company-wide town hall meeting, he actually stood on the main stage and publicly mocked my life's work. He called the Sentinel Protocol a clunky rust bucket that was strangling the bank's growth. His brilliant, visionary solution was to rip out my 6 years of bespoke architecture and replace it with a cheap, flashy artificial intelligence application developed by a tech startup owned by his college fraternity brother. The office environment rapidly deteriorated into a daily psychological war zone. The strategy meetings became completely unbearable. Whenever I opened my mouth to explain the catastrophic legal risks of downgrading our fraud detection framework, Preston would loudly interrupt me. He would wave his hand dismissively and say, "You are stuck in the past, Madison. We need agility. We need to move fast and break things." But he did not stop at simply talking over me. He initiated a systematic campaign to strip away my power. One morning, I logged in to find he had quietly revoked my administrative access to the core transaction servers. Then the real bloodbath began. Over the course of 3 weeks, he ruthlessly fired all the veteran engineers on my team. He systematically purged the brilliant, quiet minds who actually understood the complex architecture of our financial security. To fill their empty desks, he brought in a flock of cheap, fresh-out-of-college interns. Their only real qualification was their desperate willingness to smile and blindly agree with every single terrible idea Preston threw their way. They did not know the difference between a secure hash algorithm and a basic spreadsheet, but they wore the company-branded fleece vests and clapped loudly at his speeches. He thought he had completely neutralized me. He thought that by removing my access and isolating me, he could operate in the dark. But Preston was not just an arrogant fool. He was deeply, dangerously greedy. He did not realize that when you code a system from scratch with your own two hands, you know every single hidden doorway. Despite my restricted permissions, I started noticing subtle, bizarre anomalies echoing through the secondary routing data. I dug deeper and uncovered his real agenda. Preston was not just upgrading the software. He was quietly setting up invisible, unvetted transaction pipelines for a very specific group of elite VIP clients. He was intentionally bypassing the standard compliance checks to allow massive, unverified capital to flow freely through our accounts. Millions upon millions of dollars were moving without a single security flag being raised. He was doing this solely to artificially inflate our quarterly revenue reports, trying to make himself look like a financial genius to the board of directors. He was turning a prestigious investment bank into a high-speed digital laundromat for dirty money, and he viewed me and my Sentinel protocol as the only remaining hurdles in his way. The calendar invite popped up at exactly 10:15 in the morning. No subject line, just a location, the executive glass conference room on the top floor. When I walked in, the air conditioning was humming at a freezing temperature, but the human resources director sitting at the edge of the mahogany table was sweating through her silk blouse. Preston, of course, looked entirely too relaxed. He was slouched deep into his leather chair, one ankle resting on his knee, rhythmically tapping a solid gold pen against his smartphone. "Madison," Preston began, not even bothering to look up from his screen. "I will get straight to the point. We are letting you go. Your refusal to adapt to our new fast-paced environment simply does not align with our restructuring vision." The human resources director slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood. The only sound in the room was the sharp friction of the heavy paper sliding against the table. I did not blink. I did not speak. I simply opened the folder. Inside was a severance agreement and a technical handover mandate. Preston leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, invading my space. "You have exactly 2 hours to clear out your desk and hand over the master administrative rights. But before you go, there is a specific clause on page 4 you need to execute immediately. My new artificial intelligence team cannot integrate their software because your legacy code is blocking their access. The document legally requires you to remove all manual encryption layers and old security whitelists to clear the way for the new integrated artificial intelligence system." He stared at me, waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for me to cry, to beg, to scream about unfairness. He wanted the satisfaction of watching me break. Instead, I felt the corners of my mouth slowly curve upwards into a cold, quiet smile. Preston was a man who lived entirely on the surface. He had absolutely no idea what he had just demanded. He did not understand that those security whitelists were not roadblocks. They were blindfolds. Years ago, the previous executive board forced me to code those specific exceptions into the Sentinel. Those whitelists were the only things keeping the system from actively auditing the bank's most powerful shareholders. They were the invisible digital shields hiding the incredibly shady, borderline illegal transactions of the financial elite from automatically triggering alerts to the Federal Reserve. The Sentinel was a bloodhound, the whitelists were its muzzle, and Preston was ordering me, in writing, to take the muzzle off. "Removing the core exclusion parameters is a massive structural change," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and monotone. "If I strip away the whitelists, the system will treat every single account exactly the same. No exceptions for the executive suite. No exceptions for your very important person pipelines." "Exactly," Preston scoffed, rolling his eyes as if he were explaining basic math to a child. "Complete transparency, zero friction, no more of your ridiculous manual barriers holding up our capital flow. Do it." I tapped my fingernail against the glass table. "I am going to need that directive explicitly authorized. I will not be held legally liable for the fallout of stripping the bank's custom security protocols. Sign this physical copy next to the clause, and I need you to send me an email explicitly stating your order to remove all exception barriers." Preston let out a loud, theatrical sigh of annoyance, grabbing the paper. "You are bureaucratic right up to the bitter end. Madison." He aggressively scribbled his signature on the dotted line. Less than 30 seconds later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was his email, sent from his chief executive account, confirming the exact phrasing I requested. He looked at me with a triumphant, arrogant smirk, entirely convinced he had just checkmated me. 2 hours. Madison, he warned, standing up to adjust his suit jacket. "Do not make me call security." I walked out of the glass room and returned to my workstation. I did not take 2 hours. I only needed about 10 minutes. I sat down and pulled up the master command terminal. The glowing green text reflected in my eyes. I did not plant a virus. I did not sabotage a single line of functional code. Sabotage is illegal. Sabotage is for amateurs. I practice the highest, most dangerous form of corporate warfare, malicious compliance. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard. Each loud, rhythmic click felt like a heavy stone being laid for Preston's tomb. I navigated to the core directory. I highlighted the massive folder labeled Executive Whitelist Protocols. Hit delete, confirm, execute. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The system rebooted, deep within the server room. The Sentinel woke up. It was no longer bound by corporate politics. It was pure, unadulterated logic, and it was finally allowed to see everything. I calmly locked my terminal. I picked up a small cardboard box, placing only my favorite coffee mug and a framed photograph inside. I did not take a single proprietary document. I walked toward the elevators, stopping only to pull my plastic employee identification badge from my lanyard. I tossed it into the aluminum trash bin. The heavy plastic hit the bottom with a hollow, satisfying thud. I stepped into the elevator, pushed the button for the lobby, and walked out of the Aegis Vertex Financial Building into the blinding Texas sunlight. I held my head high, breathing in the fresh air, leaving behind a perfectly functioning fraud detection system that would no longer spare a single soul. I traded the suffocating, concrete heat of Texas for the crisp, pine-scented air of the deep Colorado mountains, using the incredibly generous severance package Preston had so eagerly signed off on. I rented a sprawling, secluded log cabin located miles away from the nearest cell tower, for the first time in over half a decade. I did not have a company smartphone buzzing relentlessly against my ribs. I spent my mornings sitting in a rocking chair on a heavy wooden porch, drinking black coffee and watching the morning mist roll over the jagged peaks. I was entirely disconnected from the corporate universe, completely untouched by the high-stakes digital world. I was at total peace. Back down in the city of Austin, Preston was busy taking his arrogant victory laps. During a brief drive into a small mountain town for groceries, I connected to a local coffee shop wireless network and saw his latest post on LinkedIn. He had uploaded a high-resolution photograph of himself standing in the center of the trading floor, holding a crystal flute of extremely expensive champagne, surrounded by his newly hired, grinning interns. The caption was a masterpiece of corporate delusion. He openly bragged about shedding dead weight, streamlining archaic processes, and successfully ushering Aegis Vertex Financial into a bright, frictionless new era. He was practically throwing a public parade for himself just for firing me. For the first 48 hours, Preston felt entirely vindicated. The user interface of his fraternity brother's cheap artificial intelligence application glowed with a reassuring, vibrant green color across the massive monitors. The system showed 0 alerts. It flagged 0 transactions. The capital was flowing seamlessly, faster than ever before. Preston strutted through the engineering bay, loudly laughing to his executive vice presidents. "See, I told you she was holding us back," he boasted. He genuinely believed that my previous warnings were nothing but the paranoid, overly dramatic ramblings of a territorial engineer trying to protect her job. He was dead wrong. The shiny new artificial intelligence dashboard was nothing but a completely useless cosmetic shell. It was a slick, superficial coat of paint slapped over a nuclear reactor, down in the deepest, darkest layers of the server architecture. The Sentinel was wide awake. I had followed Preston's direct orders to the absolute letter. I had removed the manual encryption layers. I had permanently deleted the security whitelists. The digital muzzle was gone, for the very first time since its creation 6 years ago. The Sentinel was operating with absolute, terrifying autonomy. It no longer recognized the concept of a very important person. It did not care about political connections, legacy accounts, or generational wealth. It simply began processing the bank's most elite clients with the exact same ruthless, algorithmic scrutiny it applied to common street-level credit card fraudsters. The very first major crack in Preston's perfect illusion appeared on Wednesday afternoon. A highly influential, sitting United States senator attempted to move $50 million through a complex web of offshore holdings. In the past, my carefully coded whitelist would have recognized the special account number, quietly suppressed the automated red flags, and allowed the massive sum to slide through unnoticed by the authorities. Not anymore. The Unchained Sentinel immediately intercepted the transfer. It analyzed the routing nodes in a fraction of a second, identified the destination as a notorious tax haven shell company, and slammed the digital vault shut. The system automatically froze the entire $50 million under suspicion of severe money laundering. But the Sentinel did not stop there. Following federal financial compliance laws to the absolute maximum degree, it instantly compiled a comprehensive data log and fired an anonymous, encrypted report directly to the Internal Revenue Service. Less than 1 hour later, the private banking division descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The VIP customer service desk, usually a place of quiet, polite murmurs, erupted with ringing telephones, furious billionaires, aggressive hedge fund managers, and powerful political operatives were screaming into their receivers, demanding to know why their massive capital reserves were suddenly locked down. Panicked account managers sprinted down the hallways to the engineering floor, begging the new technical team to fix the glitch. Preston's hand-picked college graduates scrambled across their mechanical keyboards, sweat dripping down their faces as they frantically searched the new artificial intelligence software for a solution. Just click the unfreeze button, find the override command. One of the senior managers yelled at them. They clicked wildly through the green dashboard, desperately hunting for a way to reverse the automated action. But there was no solution to be found. They were hunting for an override button that simply did not exist anymore. They could not bypass the lockdown because the master override permissions were tied directly to the manual exception barriers and per the explicit, legally binding, written instructions of the chief executive officer himself. Those barriers had been completely and irreversibly eradicated. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the situation had escalated from a localized departmental panic into a full-blown institutional apocalypse. The unmuzzled system had worked tirelessly through the weekend. Over 400 of the most exclusive, highly guarded VIP accounts at Aegis Vertex Financial were now completely locked down tight. The lifeblood of the entire investment bank was suddenly and violently severed. The daily capital flow was entirely paralyzed. Billions of dollars in pending trades, corporate acquisitions, and international wire transfers were frozen in digital purgatory. Up in the executive suite, the atmosphere was suffocating. The arrogant, composed facade Preston had worn just days earlier was completely shattered. He stood in the center of the frantic engineering bay, his designer suit jacket discarded, his expensive silk shirt stained with nervous sweat. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Shut it down. I do not care what you have to do. Just kill the program. Pull the physical servers out of the wall if you have to," he roared at the terrified group of recent college graduates he had hired to replace my veteran team. A pale, trembling intern stared at the glowing green text of the master terminal, his hands hovering uselessly over the mechanical keyboard. "We cannot do that. Sir, we literally cannot turn it off," the intern stammered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. If we forcefully terminate the core process, we trigger the fail-safe. The architecture is hardwired to the federal data retention mandate. If we pull the plug, the system will assume the bank is under a hostile cyber attack. It will immediately execute a permanent, irreversible encryption protocol on every single transaction record from the past 10 years. We would lose everything. Preston stared at the screen, his face draining of all color. They were entirely trapped. They could not move forward, and they could not retreat. But the absolute worst was yet to come. The algorithm, now operating at maximum capacity and completely devoid of human interference, was no longer just looking outward at the client portfolios. It was a perfectly logical machine, and logic dictates that the highest security risks often come from within. The sentinel turned its unblinking digital gaze inward. It began sweeping the internal executive ledgers. It did not take long for the system to find the rot. For the past 3 months, Preston had been quietly skimming massive, illegal commission kickbacks. He had been meticulously funneling the stolen funds through a complex, shadowy labyrinth of offshore accounts down in the Cayman Islands. With my old whitelist protections in place, his personal routing numbers had been cloaked, shielded from the automated audits. But Preston himself had ordered me to burn those shields to the ground. Stripped of his invisibility cloak, his dirty financial footprints were glaringly obvious to the machine. The Sentinel instantly classified the chief executive officer of the bank as a critical internal threat. Without hesitation, the system automatically initiated the red flag protocol. I had originally designed this highly aggressive countermeasure specifically to combat elite foreign hackers trying to breach our walls. I never imagined it would be used on the boss. The protocol was entirely automated. It bypassed the legal department. It bypassed the board of directors. In less than a second, the system gathered up every single digital receipt, every hidden wire transfer, every forged authorization signature, and every piece of damning evidence regarding the Cayman Islands accounts. It compiled the data into a massive, heavily encrypted dossier and fired it directly to the Enforcement Division of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission without requiring a single human to review or approve the action. Standing in the chaotic server room, Preston watched the notification flash across the main monitor. Red flag protocol executed. Target Chief Executive Officer, Destination Securities and Exchange Commission. In that agonizing, silent moment, the horrifying truth finally washed over him. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. I had not planted a destructive virus. I had not sabotaged the bank infrastructure out of petty revenge. I had done something far more devastating. I had transformed his network into a machine of absolute blind justice, by legally forcing me to eradicate the exception lists, by arrogantly demanding a frictionless system of total transparency. He had personally removed his own armor. He had handed me the loaded weapon, ordered me to point it at him, and then he had squeezed the trigger himself. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. You cannot keep secrets on Wall Street, especially not when federal regulators receive an automated bomb of undeniable evidence. Before the lunch hour even arrived, the news of massive internal fraud and looming federal investigations had leaked directly to the reporters at Bloomberg. The financial markets reacted with ruthless efficiency. Panic selling consumed the trading floor. In a single morning, the stock price of Aegis Vertex Financial evaporated by a staggering 35%. The legacy of the Sterling family was currently burning to the ground, and I was hundreds of miles away, sitting quietly on a wooden porch, listening to the wind blow through the pine trees. The peaceful Wednesday morning was completely shattered by the deafening, rhythmic thumping of heavy rotor blades. I stepped out onto my wooden porch, holding my warm ceramic mug, and watched a sleek black private helicopter touch down clumsily in the open clearing just a few hundred yards from my front door. The violent downdraft whipped the pine needles into a frantic storm. Out stepped Preston Sterling. He did not look like the untouchable Wall Street prince who had fired me just a few short days ago. He looked like a hunted, cornered animal. His $1,000 Italian leather shoes were instantly caked in thick mountain mud. His custom-tailored suit jacket was violently wrinkled and completely soaked in nervous sweat. His hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, was a chaotic, wind-blown mess. He stumbled heavily up the dirt path, gasping for the thin, high-altitude air. The absolute arrogance that used to define him was entirely gone. He looked exactly like a beggar wearing stolen designer clothes. He did not even bother to knock. He slammed his fists violently against the heavy oak door frame. "I am going to destroy you, Madison," he screamed, his voice raw and cracking with pure panic. "I have a team of corporate lawyers drafting the papers right now. I am taking you to federal court. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life in a maximum security prison for corporate sabotage, malicious destruction of private property, and cyber terrorism. You ruined my bank." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I gently pushed the screen door open, looked him dead in his bloodshot, terrified eyes, and offered a polite, completely detached smile. "Good morning, Preston. You look like you could use some caffeine. Come inside. I was just making a fresh pot of pour-over coffee." He froze, completely disoriented by my utter lack of fear or defensive anger. He stumbled blindly into the quiet, rustic kitchen, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the small space like a trapped bird looking for an exit. I took my time. I deliberately moved slowly, pouring the steaming water over the dark, roasted grounds, letting the rich, earthy aroma fill the room. The psychological tension was incredibly heavy, broken only by the soft dripping of the coffee and his ragged, panicked breathing. I handed him a mug. His hands were shaking so violently that the dark liquid spilled over the rim, burning his fingers. He did not even seem to notice the pain. I walked over to the small wooden dining table and picked up a single, crisp sheet of printer paper. I laid it down flat right in front of him. It was the exact legal document from our meeting with the Human Resources Department. Right there, at the bottom of the page, was his own arrogant, hurried signature. "I did not sabotage a single thing, Preston," I explained, keeping my voice incredibly calm and precise, slicing through his chaotic panic like a surgical scalpel. "I did not write a virus. I did not plant a malicious bug. I merely updated the system architecture to ensure it complied 100% with federal anti-money laundering regulations. I gave you exactly what you asked for. I executed your grand vision of a completely transparent, frictionless financial institution. If you and your elite friends are currently getting caught by the authorities, it is simply because you are breaking the law, not because my software is broken." He stared down at his own signature. The last remaining shred of his fabricated confidence instantly evaporated. The horrifying reality of his inescapable situation crushed him completely. To my absolute astonishment, the incredibly wealthy, infinitely privileged chief executive officer of Aegis Vertex Financial actually collapsed to the floor. He dropped to his knees right there on the hardwood planks of my kitchen. He grabbed the edge of the table, looking up at me with genuine tears streaming down his face. "Please, Madison," he begged, sobbing openly, completely abandoning whatever pride he had left. "Please, I will give you anything you want. I will fire the entire executive board. I will officially name you the Chief Technology Officer tomorrow morning. I will give you 10% of the company stock. I will wire $5 million into a private account for you right now. Just log back in, take control of the servers, delete the federal reports, and tell the Securities and Exchange Commission it was a system glitch. I am begging you to save me." The silence returned to the cabin, heavy and final. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, thoroughly savoring the bitter taste. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling at my feet. Then, I simply smiled and pointed a single finger toward the center of the wooden table, right next to the printed document. Sitting there was my smartphone. The screen was mostly dark, but a tiny glowing red dot was pulsing steadily at the top of the interface. The voice recording application had been running since the exact moment he started screaming threats at my front door. I leaned forward slightly, matching his terrified gaze. I think the federal investigators will find your recorded offer to bribe a witness and cover up a massive corporate crime incredibly interesting. Preston. Preston scrambled out of my cabin exactly the way he came in, looking like a thoroughly defeated man. He practically tripped over his own ruined designer shoes running back to his idling helicopter. I did not try to stop him. I simply stood on the porch and watched the black machine lift off, vanishing over the jagged tree line. The moment the deafening roar of the engine faded into the distance, I walked back inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I connected to the secure satellite network. I drafted a single, perfectly professional email. I attached the high-definition audio file containing every single word of his desperate, incriminating bribery attempt. I populated the recipient list with the direct contact addresses for the federal investigators at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and every single member of the Aegis Vertex Financial Board of Directors. Then, I firmly pressed send. The fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. By Friday afternoon, the board of directors had convened an emergency, closed-door summit in the main executive boardroom. They were frantically trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding and salvage whatever was left of the bank. Preston stood at the head of the long mahogany table, sweating profusely, trying to weave another web of lies to save his own skin. He never even got to finish his sentence. The heavy oak doors to the boardroom did not just open, they were aggressively pushed wide. 5 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers stepped into the room, right there, in front of the most powerful shareholders and the incredibly wealthy investors he had tried so hard to impress. The agents ordered Preston to turn around. They secured his wrists behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. They read him his Miranda rights while the entire room watched in stunned, heavy silence. The financial news networks had an absolute field day. The proud, seemingly untouchable legacy of the Sterling family was instantly pulverized across every single major newspaper and television broadcast. The golden boy of the corporate hustle culture was publicly exposed as nothing more than a common, desperate criminal. Less than 2 hours after Preston was escorted into the back of a federal vehicle, my phone rang. It was the chairman of the board. The man who had previously signed off on my termination was now practically weeping through the receiver, begging me to come back and save their institution. The bank was still completely paralyzed, and they were bleeding millions of dollars by the hour. I listened to his frantic pleas for several minutes before I finally spoke. "I am not returning as an employee," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I will return as an independent security contractor. My firm will retain complete, unquestionable copyright ownership over every single line of code within the Sentinel protocol. You will lease the software from me. My consulting fee will be exactly 50 times my previous annual salary, payable immediately upon signing. Furthermore, I report to absolutely no one. Do we have an agreement?" The chairman did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. "Yes," he gasped. "Whatever you want. Madison, just please turn the capital flow back on." The following Monday, I walked back through the towering glass doors of the Aegis Vertex Financial Building. I did not have an employee badge anymore, and I certainly did not need one. The security guards immediately stepped aside to let me pass. The terrified engineers and the junior executives simply stared at me in complete awe as I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. I bypassed my old, cramped cubicle entirely. I walked straight into the massive, sunlit corner office that used to belong to Preston Sterling. I sat down in the incredibly expensive leather chair, placed my laptop on the pristine glass desk, and connected to the central mainframe. It took me exactly one single command line to stabilize the bank. I wrote a swift, elegant patch that restored the legitimate capital flows and unblocked the verified corporate accounts. The institutional paralysis was over in a matter of seconds. However, I did not restore a single one of the old security exceptions. The VIP whitelist remained permanently deleted. The automated crime reporting feature stayed fully active and locked behind an encryption key that only I possessed. I leaned back in the chair and turned my head to look out the massive panoramic window. The sprawling, glittering skyline of Austin stretched out endlessly before me. I picked up my mug and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of black coffee. On the massive flat-screen television mounted to the wall, a news anchor was reading the latest breaking update. Preston Sterling had just been denied bail and was officially facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I smiled softly to myself. I glanced back down at my primary monitor. Deep within the core architecture, the Sentinel protocol quietly pulsed with a steady, reassuring green light. It was a beautiful, perfect machine. And after 6 long years, it was finally receiving the absolute respect it deserved. Thank you all so profoundly for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please let me know your city or country down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this journey and felt the satisfaction of this corporate justice, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous contribution directly pays our hardworking staff, helping them support their families and allowing us to keep creating these high-quality revenge stories for you. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.